Mr President. I'm pleased to rise this morning to open the Council debate on the 2019-20 budget debate. And this, of course, is the first budget of the re-elected Andrews government, and it's the first budget where the government needs to reconcile the commitments it made for the election last year with the realities of the constraints of the budget settings and the budget parameters that exist in the state of Victoria. And we've seen, of course, through the course of last year, a slowing property market, which has had a significant impact on the budget. And we've seen this week the way in which the government and the Treasurer have sought to cut the cloth to address that significant revenue change. And I'll come to that in some detail in a minute. But, Mr President, I'd like to start with a bit of scene setting for the 2019-20 budget. Of course, one of the few times where we get to look at the way in which the Victorian economy is performing is in the context of the budget, because the budget papers do report on what the government forecasts economic growth to be, what the government or Treasury forecasts employment growth to be, unemployment to be. It's really the one time of the year where we look at the Victorian economy in the context of the policy settings which are made by the government. And it's fair to say that a state budget isn't a huge driver of economic activity in the state. Despite what the state government likes to claim from time to time, the reality is most of the policy levers for economic activity are not driven through the state budget. They can, however, be driven through policy settings of the government. Policy settings which either encourage or deter investment, policy settings which encourage or deter employment. And we've seen a number of those levers pulled by this government over the last 4 years, policy settings which have acted to deter investment in Victoria, which have acted, and we're seeing now with the implementation or soon implementation of the labour hire legislation, levers which deter employment, and we're yet to see the full impact that that legislation is going to have in a whole number of sectors where impact was not anticipated. And one of those sectors which looks to be heavily impacted by that labour hire legislation is in fact the ICT consulting and contracting sector, which was something never on the radar with the passage of that legislation, but appears is now going to be a victim of an unintended victim, an unintended consequence of the passage of that legislation. So, looking at the policy settings the government has made over the last 4 or 5 years, it's worth looking at where the Victorian economy is performing relative to our biggest neighbour, New South Wales, the other large state in Australia which has a comparable broad-based economy. And we see that for the most recent data released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that the Victorian economy is actually substantially underperforming that of New South Wales. Economic output in New South Wales on a per head basis for the most recent financial year 17-18 show that GDP per capita in New South Wales was some $74,900. However, in Victoria, it's only $66,000. So there is a substantially greater level of economic output per head of population in New South Wales than there is in Victoria. And over the course of the life of the Andrews government back to 2014, that gap has been widening. New South Wales has been pulling further and further ahead on a per capita basis than Victoria. And we see that repeated in wages. Average weekly earnings for a citizen in New South Wales for the most recent data are $1,685 for a full-time worker in New South Wales, and only $1,624 for a Victorian worker. So New South Wales, the citizens of New South Wales, the New South Wales economy produces substantially more per head of population, and people living and working in New South Wales earn more than Victorians. And this is a margin which has been growing. Interestingly, we hear the Victorian government talk about Victoria's fair share, and we saw the outrageous political campaign run in the lead up to the federal election, arguing that Victoria's not getting its fair share, and the government's the government's basis for arguing whether Victoria's getting its fair share or not is to reference Victoria's population share. The fact that Victoria has a little over a quarter of the nation's population, around 25.8% of the nation's population live here in Victoria. And it's interesting with that knowledge to look at the economic activity in Victoria, because despite the fact that we have 25.8% of the nation's population in Victoria, we're only producing 23% of the economic output. So Victoria is underrepresented in economic output in this state. We are not producing our population share of economic activity. And you could think, well, that's because Victoria is not a mining state, and that states like Queensland and Western Australia, which are heavy in mining, heavy in mineral exports, are producing above their population share. However, when you look at New South Wales, which is also not a substantial mining economy, given the diverse nature of its economy, New South Wales is in fact producing above its population share. New South Wales accounts for just under 32%, 31.9% of the nation's population, and is in fact producing 32.7% of the nation's economic output. So New South Wales punches above its population weight in economic output, and Victoria is below its population share in economic output. And the difference, Mr. President, are the policy levers, the policy settings of the government, of the state government. And that highlights where government policy settings can have an impact on economic performance in the state, on the propensity of business to invest in the state, and of the propensity of business to employ people in the state. And where you set up a regime which has a series of hurdles to investment, a series of barriers to entry to investment, where you set up a regulatory framework which discourages employment, over time you get the state underperforming. And that is why we're now seeing GDP output per head lower in Victoria than New South Wales. That's why we're seeing Victoria producing less than its population share of economic output compared to that in New South Wales. And of course, where is that felt for the citizens? It's felt in their hip pocket, with average weekly earnings in Victoria being lower than average weekly earnings in New South Wales. Now, turning to the expenditure side, or the revenue expenditure side of the budget, away from the economic policy settings, but to the actual impact of this budget on the state finances. The Treasurer presented this budget on Monday as a budget where he needed to respond to a revenue problem. The Treasurer, in his delivery and in his public commentary, has suggested we've suddenly found a softening of the property market, which has had a hit on stamp duty revenue, on property transactions, and the government's needed to respond to that. What the Treasurer didn't talk about in his speech, and hasn't talked about in his commentary, public commentary, is that downturn in stamp duty revenue was entirely foreseeable. It is a function of an economic cycle. It's a function of ebbs and flows in the economy. Every government over a period of time sees that. There are strength in some revenue items and weaknesses in other. And that is on a regular cycle. The previous coalition government in Victoria had to deal with it, and the current Labor government had to deal with it. What we haven't seen from this government, though, is recognition of that economic cycle. And through the first half, or the majority in fact of the first term of the Andrews government, we saw a big upswing in revenue. We saw a strong payroll tax revenue line. We saw a buoyant property market which led to very strong land tax receipts, very strong stamp duty receipts on property transactions, effectively delivering massive windfall revenue to the state treasury. Revenue far ahead of, in the billions of dollars ahead of, what had been forecast over the longer term. And rather than the government recognising that that revenue was windfall revenue, it was above average revenue and it wouldn't continue, we saw the government take that revenue and build it into baseline expenditure. So rather than recognising a big proportion of this revenue is a one-off, it's not going to occur every year, it's well above the baseline, and therefore we will put it into capital, the government decided, well, we've got the revenue this year and we'll spend it. We'll build it into the cost base of the state. So what we've seen over the life of the Andrews government is a massive blowout in the state's cost base. Rather than being prudent, rather than recognising that revenue ebbs and flows, the government's simply taken every extra dollar of revenue and expended it and built it into the cost base of the state. Excuse me. So we've seen in the period since this government came to office in 2014, if you compare the last benchmark of the previous coalition government, which was the pre-election budget update, independent budget update released by the Treasury immediately prior to the 2014 election, that pre-election budget update forecast expenditure by the state government of $51.9 billion for that financial year. This budget that's been brought down this week forecasts state expenditure of $69.9 billion, almost $70 billion. That is an increase of just under 35% in 5 years. 35% in 5 years, more than 6% compound growth every year for the last 5 years. And I'd say to the people of Victoria, who in Victoria has had their household budget growing at the rate of 6% each and every year for the last 5 years? We've seen massive growth in expenditure by this government, which has seized on windfall revenue gains, and rather than taking them to the bank, recognising they are one-offs, they've built it into the cost base of this state. So we're now spending 35% more than we were just 5 years ago. And that growth rate, of course, is unsustainable. And we've seen over the last 5 years, every year the Treasurer brings down a budget, he said, oh, well, next year we'll be prudent. Next year we'll only have expenditure growth of 1 or 2%. But when next year comes around, every time it hasn't occurred. And we've seen massive blowouts in expenditure growth. Excuse me. Which has resulted in us having a budget bottom line, an expenditure bottom line that's 35% higher in just 5 years. And where's a lot of that revenue gone? Where's a lot of the expenditure? We've seen it go into employee expenses, growing the public service, increasing the cost of the public service, which is up by almost 42% over that same 5-year period. Now, the problem, Mr. President, when the government builds that surplus revenue, that windfall revenue, into the bottom line, and the economic cycle turns, it then has to scramble to find that revenue to make up the shortfall. And that's what we have with the budget from the Treasurer this week. Rather than having been prudent on expenditure, having maintained prudent and sustainable expenditure growth over the life of the government over the last 5 years, we saw massive expenditure growth every year, soaking up every extra dollar of windfall revenue. And now that the property market has softened, the government is scrambling for revenue. And we've seen, just to put that in context, Mr. President, it's worth looking at the forecasts for expenditure, which were produced in the budget last year, and which have been forecast in the budget this year, to give an indication of just what the shift has been. Looking at the 2018-19 budget, the forecasts for the current budget year, being 19-20, 12 months ago the Treasury was forecasting that property stamp duty on property transactions were going to be $7,212 million. This year, for the same period, that forecast has now been cut to $5.896 billion, a loss of $1.4 billion in expected stamp duty revenue. Interestingly, Mr. President, we are seeing the government continue to forecast strong land tax revenue at $3.6 billion. But the big hit to the budget has been on the expectation of stamp duty, with a loss of, in the order of the magnitude of $1.3, $1.4 billion in revenue from stamp duty on transfer of property. And of course that is a figure which is highly susceptible to changes in economic conditions, because it is driven by both the value of property and the volume of property transacted. And we've seen over the last 12 months property prices have certainly fallen, and because stamp duty on property is a very progressive scale of tax, it takes only a minor decline in property values for the amount of stamp duty payable on a given property to fall dramatically. Likewise, with the drop-off in the proportion, in the number of properties being sold, as the other key driver of stamp duty revenue, we've seen that drop off in aggregate of almost $1.4 billion. So rather than the government cutting its cloth on expenditure to match its revenue, as it should have done prudently over the last 5 years, recognising what was windfall and what was baseline revenue, it's had to scramble to be able to accommodate the commitments, spending commitments it made in the election last year, on top of the massive blowout in expenditure which had occurred as baseline expenditure over the last 5 years. And accordingly we've seen the Treasurer now scrambling to increase the revenue base of the state to make up for that hole in stamp duty revenue. And so we have in this year's budget a number of revenue initiatives. The Treasurer, in presenting the budget, has forecast for the budget year a surplus of $1,050 million. But in order to get to that bottom line surplus figure, the Treasurer has taken some extraordinary steps in gathering revenue for this year's budget. And one of the extraordinary steps the Treasurer has taken is in respect of dividends. Now, all governments take dividends from excuse me, financial corporations like the TAC, WorkCover, VFMC, VMIA. All governments take dividends from the water boards and other trading corporations that sit within the public sector in Victoria. But the rationale for those dividends has always been one of having those entities operate on a commercial basis. In the same way that a private sector insurer would pay a dividend to its shareholders, it's been policy to have a dividend paid by the state insurers as well. And traditionally that dividend has been tied to profits of the corporation. In the case of the TAC and WorkCover, that's either been the bottom line profit or it's been the performance from insurance operations. But there was always a basis for the levying of a dividend from those corporations, a proportion of bottom line profit or a proportion of insurance profit. What we've seen in this year's budget though is simply a cash grab. The Treasurer has said he wants a surplus of $1 billion, or a little over $1 billion. Where's he going to get it? Well, this year he's decided to take $890 million out of the Transport Accident Commission, to deliver his $1 billion surplus. And he said over the next 2 years, as he's seeking to deliver further surpluses, that will increase to $982 million next year and $1 billion the year after. So those amounts bear no resemblance to the profit that the TAC is forecast to produce in those years. They have no relationship to the operating performance of those corporations, as has traditionally been the basis for levying dividends in the past. They are simply the gap the Treasurer needs to make up. And the cash cow, the convenient cash cow for the next couple of years, is the TAC, with $890 million to be pulled out this year. Interestingly, we see in the out years, Mr President, that the government is taking the same approach with work cover, seeking to take from work cover $125 million in 21-22 and then a further $575 million in 22-23. I have to say the hypocrisy of this government in now taking a dividend from work cover is extraordinary, because when the mechanism was introduced by the previous government to allow for the collection of a dividend from work cover, which was done when I was work cover minister, the now government, then opposition, screamed blue murder, that it was outrageous to be taking a dividend from work cover. That was the money of employers, it was the money of workers, and they would never do it. Yet we now see in this budget, where they have failed to manage expenditure over the last 5 years, a footnote showing that some $700 million is to be taken out of work cover. I might add far in excess of the amounts that have been forecast by the previous government to be taken as a dividend in proportion to operating performance. We're seeing some $700 million to be ripped out of work cover in the forward estimates. And I have to say, Mr President, the silence coming from those parties who were vocal 5 years ago about the very concept of a work cover dividend, Trades Hall Council among others, is extraordinary, but not surprising. So we see the surpluses in this year's budget being propped up and delivered almost in their entirety by the dividends which are being taken out of the financial corporations which sit outside the general government sector of the state of Victoria. But we also see a number of tax measures, Mr President, and these are something that the House will have an opportunity to talk about in more depth when the State Taxation Legislation Amendment Bill is debated in this House. But on the back of a federal election barely 10 days ago, where the Australian population absolutely rejected the platform which was advanced by the Labor Party and Bill Shorten, a platform that sought to divide the Australian community, set up a class war in the Australian community between what the Labor Party claimed were the haves and the have-nots, with a taxation regime which in reality would have hit working families in Victoria, working families across the nation, a platform which was comprehensively rejected by the Australian people. We see with the budget introduced on Monday, the Victorian government going down the same path, seeking to set up what it regards as a tax regime to soak what it thinks are the rich in the Victorian community through increased property taxes, expanding the base of land tax, and indeed introducing a new levy on what it regards as luxury cars. I'll touch on those 2 points in particular, Mr President. I note that they are among a number of tax changes which seek to typically broaden the base of taxes in this state with the intent of collecting in the budget year in total an extra $170 million in tax revenue. But the two in particular I want to refer to are what's described in the budget papers as remove the land tax exemption for contiguous land in metropolitan areas. This is a tax increase which the Treasurer has characterised as the swimming pool tax or the tennis court tax. It applies where a landowner has two properties next to each other on different titles, but because they are next to each other, next to the principal place of residence, they have been exempt from land tax. The Treasurer has said, this is outrageous, this is all these rich people in Toorak, they've got tennis courts and swimming pools on the second block, and we're going to tax them. In reality, Mr President, many of these properties many of these families where the adjoining property is owned on a separate title, are families throughout the suburbs. They are migrant families who have bought the adjoining property 30, 40, 50 years ago. They have a veggie patch on it, or a garden on it, and they've held that second property, that adjoining property, might only be a couple of hundred square metres, in a separate title because that's the way they bought it. Suddenly they're to be hit by land tax for the first time because this government thinks they're rich. And while the government has forecast revenue from this measure, I think in reality, Mr President, they'll get very little from this very little revenue from this measure, because all it will do will force these landowners who have, as I said, maybe held the adjoining property for 30, 40 years, simply to consolidate their titles, which will lead to no revenue to the state. One of the other examples of where the Treasurer and the government has sought to divide the Victorian community into what it regards the have and the have-nots is the introduction of its ill-considered so-called motor vehicle duty on luxury vehicles. And the Treasurer has set a threshold of $100,000 as the trigger point for this expanded stamp duty on vehicle purchases, with a higher threshold for next level up. And has basically said anyone who's spending $100,000 on a vehicle must be rich and will soak them. On Tuesday, Mr President, the Treasurer was asked at a Vecchi lunch as to what he would say to a family who may have been saving up 20 years to buy a vehicle that falls into that category. May have been saving for 20 years to buy a Toyota Land Cruiser Sahara, which costs a bit over $100,000. They might be approaching retirement. They may have been saving for 20 years to buy this Toyota Land Cruiser, to tow a caravan around Australia in their retirement. And the Treasurer, in an extraordinarily dismissive response to that question at the Vecchi lunch, as to what he would say to a family that had saved 20 years to buy a Toyota Land Cruiser, his response was, "I'll tell them to get a life." The Treasurer of Victoria, in his arrogance and in his dismissiveness of Victorian citizens, thinks anyone who's actually saved for a Toyota Land Cruiser over a number of years should get a life. That's the approach of this government, that's the approach of this Treasurer to the concerns of regular Victorians. The fact that the Treasurer doesn't understand that Victorians may have dreams and aspirations of this nature, may save for 10 or 20 years for an acquisition like that. He thinks it's fair game to tax them because in his eyes and in the Premier's eyes, those people must be rich, despite having saved for 20 years. And his dismissive approach really highlights the arrogance and attitude of this government. It was rejected by the people when Bill Shorten tried it 10 days ago leading up to the election, and I think you'd find if the Andrews government had been honest with the people of Victoria going into the election last November and put these proposals on the table, they would have been rejected as well. So, Acting President, the budget we are dealing with today and the difficulties and the challenges in this budget today are not brought about because of the winds of economic cycles. They are brought about by the failure of this government to manage over the last 5 years. Everyone knew the windfall revenue the government had over the last 5 years was just that, windfall revenue. The fact that the government failed to bank it, decided to spend it and build it into the cost base of the state over 5 years has now come home to roost as property stamp duty has come off the boil. The government is increasing taxes on people in Victoria who cannot afford them, not because it's been prudent over the last 5 years, but because it has failed to manage the budget properly, and Victorians are now paying the price.